Today we're covering a guide to writing summaries. So the first slide asks, what is a summary? And in simple terms, a summary is a condensed retelling of the content of the original text. So what you really want to focus in on is to keep your summaries objective. Don't allow yourself to analyze, interpret, or evaluate when you're writing your summary. Simply tell the reader what's in the article you read. And this is going to help you when you're going to use these summaries. These summaries are tools for you when you're writing your paper, and you want to have in a quick glance just simply what the author wrote in the article, not what your opinion of that article is. So again, in simple terms, a summary gives the reader a capsule of information about the source. And the best summaries provide what I call is even coverage of the text. So in other words, if you write a 5-sentence summary, each sentence should cover about 20% of that article. And you want to think of it as sort of zooming out on the article. Now, I asked you to write a summary of the What We Eat essay that we read last week for your journal, and some of you did a pretty good job, and some of you did some interpretation. So next week in class on Monday, we're going to talk about writing a summary of that as a group, as well as the first article that we read, the texting article, since I know you've all read those articles by now. All right, so moving on. How do I write a summary? So it seems complicated, but it's just a series of steps. And the next few slides are a step-by-step guide to make sure that you don't miss any of the required elements of an academic summary. So your final summary will end up being about 5 to 8 sentences long, depending on the length of your original source. So the first step is to identify the author and the most important piece of information about the author. So if we think about the What We Eat article, again, we're going to name that author, Mr. Schlosser. And one of the things we know about that author is that, first of all, he was a historian, but he also did a documentary, Super Size Me, on that same topic. So then we're going to identify the title of the text and what's important about the publication of that article. So in terms of What We Eat, it was actually an essay. It was not published in a journal. I think it was written specifically for readers, college readers, and it was published in 2001. So then we're going to write that into one sentence. Then we are going to identify the main thing the text is trying to do, what's the thesis of the article, and the topic of the text. So in terms of What We Eat, we know we talked about the topic being about the food industry and the fast food's effects on the food industry. And the purpose of that particular article was to expose the fast food the fast food's effect on the food industry in the United States. So then we put all of that together, what we just did in step 1, and then step 2, and we turned it into a sentence. So I have an example here in the Time magazine article, Pugs Are Precious. Social researcher Bob Smith makes the argument that pugs are the best pets to own. In our food essay, we can say in the Back to the Lake, that's where it was published, article, What We Eat, historian Mr. Schlosser makes the argument that the fast food industry vastly affected the way food is produced in the United States, and that in a single sentence tells the reader what the article, What We Eat, is about. Once you've done that, once you've identified that thesis of that source and the author and where it was published and when, next step is to take the body of your essay, your article, and divide it into 3 or 4 sections. And that depends on how long and dense your article is. So you'll look at it and you'll help read it through and you'll say, okay, well, it makes sense to separate into, generally you'll think of each section as being 2 or 3 paragraphs long. And for each of those sections, you're going to read it through and compose one sentence that objectively bottom lines each of those sections. Okay? So you compose one sentence to represent each of the sections of the body of the article. So in What We Eat, it was about probably, 20 paragraphs long. So first couple of them were introduction, and the bottom one was the conclusion. So we're talking about maybe 16 paragraphs, 15 paragraphs. So if we did in 4 sections, which makes more sense, each of your sections would have about 2 to 4 paragraphs. And we're going to write one sentence that summarizes each section. So that's going to take some thinking. What's the most important thing about each of these 3 or 4 sections? And then finally, you identify the conclusion and you write one sentence that sums up your conclusion. So your total summary will end up being, or your article summary, this body part will be 3 to 4 sentences long. Put that together with what you just did, you're talking about 5 to 7 sentences. And then finally, you need to write your citation. So I know you haven't covered, we haven't covered APA in class yet, but I have a reference link. And if you use library sources, generally there's a citation tool at the top of your digital source. So I'm going to ask you to do your best to try to write an APA reference entry for each of your sources. And you can find this PowerPoint under, it'll be in the announcement, the link will be there. But in addition, you can find this PowerPoint under the PowerPoint presentations for Module 1 under the Watch folder, and I'm doing that as I speak. And again, it's the Guide to Writing Summaries. So you can review this PowerPoint presentation at any time.